Hey everyone, today we're not going over any official law or any existing history of anything. It's another story, and this time it's a story from the perspective of one of the eyes of the emperor. So when the Custodes go into retirement, if their reaction times drop just a little, or they feel like they're not fit for service anymore, they will go out into the universe as an agent to the emperor. And those agents are called the eyes of the emperor. And I came across this lore, or the background of these guys, a little while ago. And recently I've been finishing up painting my Custodes army for the tabletop. And I've got a little kit-bashed blade champion. I'll probably put a picture on the screen somewhere. And after I was finished with them, I thought it would be a cool thing to create a story from the eyes of one of the eyes of the emperor. And in this story, this particular eye of the emperor is hunting down a world eater who escaped from the prisons underneath the imperial palace on Terra during the siege of Terra, and has been sacrificing civilians in the name of the blood god Khorne. And this particular eye of the emperor is hunting him down. So this story is about a hunt for an escaped prisoner, really, and the confrontation that ends that hunt. So hopefully you enjoy. And as always, thank you to everybody who's supporting on Patreon. And if you'd like to become a patron, you can find a link in the description below. And again, as always, if you'd like to listen to audio only, you can find the Lawkeeper's Librarian on Spotify.
This video is brought to you by GameMat EU. If you're still playing on bare table or you're looking to upgrade your tabletop games, GameMat EU have everything you need. And it's what me and my friends have been playing on for years, so I'm very happy to have them as a sponsor for this video. With their double-sided battle mat, you get two high-detailed battle designs in one single mat. Flip it over and you can play an entirely different table with an entirely different theme. These are 60 by 44 inches and perfect for the latest editions of Warhammer 40K, as well as many other different game systems. One of the things I personally love is the deployment zones and inch guides printed right onto the mat itself, so you don't have to spend all that time at the start of the game measuring everything up. The surface is waterproof and anti-reflective, and lies completely flat on the table. There's a link in the description and a discount code for 10% off site-wide when you use the code Lawkeeper. There are those who, upon first hearing the name Verath Secondus, will search their memory and find nothing there, no legend attached to it, no great deed recorded in its honor, no reason why a world so plainly made for the extraction of mediocre ore should trouble the attention of anyone beyond the administrators, whose duty it was to log its quarterly yields. It is the kind of world the galaxy contains in great abundance, and has always contained, quiet, grey, and unremarked upon. The sort of place where ordinary people live, ordinary lives in the shadow of large machinery and long shifts of manual labour. And yet it was here, on a morning when the sky hung low and permanent over a plateau of grey rock and sprawling green moss, that a man stood very still at the mouth of a descending mine shaft, and completed, in the silence of his own mind, a calculation that had taken 43 years to reach its final steps. He was not to look at a remarkable figure. His robes were dark and travel-worn at the hem, the garments of someone who had spent a great deal of time moving through the world without wishing to be noticed in it, and they had done their work well enough across the years that he had learned to trust them. At his hip, he carried a single blade, plain, unornamented, the kind of thing that draws no particular attention, though any eye trained in the matter might have paused at the sharpness of its edge and the quality of the metal, and found reason to look a little longer than was comfortable. His left eye caught the grey light and held it differently than his right, the dull silver of an augmetic, the one concession he had permitted himself when he had set aside all the other things that had once been his, and taken up instead the black robes and the long road. From below, through the vents where the deep earth breathed its slow and ancient warmth upward into the cold air, came the smell of promethium residue and stone so old that the naming of it fell somewhat short of the thing itself. Somewhere out on the plateau, one of the great drilling rigs shifted in the wind with the low and hollow groan of machinery that has been left to its own company for longer than was intended, a sound that had something solitary about it. There were no voices, there were no footsteps on the stone. The workers of Verath Secondus had stopped coming to this part of the plateau some weeks ago, and the silence they had left behind had settled into the place and made itself at home, the way silences do when they are not expected to leave. He had known for some weeks now what waited below. He had spent his time on the surface, confirming it carefully and without haste, because haste is the companion of uncertainty, and he had not felt uncertain about this in a very long time. He had watched and mapped and understood, and when all of that was done, he had given the remaining days to the slow and necessary work of making peace with the process he would follow, not with the outcome, which had never been in question, but with the shape of what 43 years of a single, unspoken purpose looks like when it finally arrives at the place where it must be resolved. He took the first step down into the shaft, and the darkness closed around him. Behind him, the grey-green world continued in its quiet indifference, the low sky, the still rigs, the slow, warm breath of the stone. And if any of it marked his passing, it gave no sign. It is a peculiar thing, the way that knowledge sometimes arrives. There are moments in a long life, and Orithas Viol had lived long enough to have collected a great many such moments. When a piece of information comes to rest in the mind with a quiet, almost domestic finality, it was not a blow, not a revelation, simply a thing becoming known, and the world rearranging itself, very slightly and very permanently, around the fact of its being known. It was on a forge world, grey and industrial and smelling of hot metal, that the archivist found him, or rather that word reached him. Through the careful network of acquaintances he had spent the better part of 2 decades cultivating in the quieter corners of the Imperium, to help support him in his work protecting the Imperium. The man was a Mechanicus archivist of some seniority. He was also dying, which meant that his communication held a clarity and a directness that he might not have managed in better health. The information he passed along was just a fragment. It was the residue of a document that had once been more complete, before someone with considerable access had gone through the Shadow Keeper's pre-heresy prisoner documentation and removed whatever they wished to remove. What was left on the record was a prisoner custody number, a cell designation in the deep sub-levels of the Imperial Palace, where the Shadow Keepers had kept their most significant prisoners, and a single notation, added at some point in the long and chaotic wake of the Siege of Terror. The notation said, "Prisoner transferred, unconfirmed." 2 words and a caveat. The kind of entry that in the normal run of archival work would be noted and passed over and eventually forgotten, filed in the great institutional memory of the Imperium alongside the 10,000 other loose ends that the heresy had left untied. Orithas read it, and then he read it again, and then he sat with it for a moment, reminding himself that the first response to information is rarely the most useful one. He cross-referenced the custody number against his own memory, which was, by any standard that might reasonably be applied to such things, considerably more reliable than most archival systems, and rather less easily corrupted. He found the match almost at once. The name that surfaced from those deep and well-ordered mental records, one that he had not thought about in a very long time. Vrakas. A world eater, taken alive during a void boarding action in the approach to the Prospero system, in the years before the heresy had declared itself openly, and the galaxy had begun its long process of tearing itself apart. He had been captured alive, which, for a warrior of his kind, was remarkable enough, because he had been somewhere, had seen something, that Imperial intelligence had decided was worth extracting. Whether they had ever succeeded in extracting it, the records did not say. Whether Vrakas had ever told them anything at all, the records did not say. What the records said in the end was only that he had been there, in that cell, in those sub-levels, and that at some point in the chaos and the darkness and the desperate grinding enormity of the Siege of Terror, the notation unconfirmed had been added, and no further entry had ever followed it. Oretha set the information down, and then he sat with it for 3 days. This, too, was something he had learned across the long years, that the mind requires time to do its best work, and that the instinct toward immediate action, however understandable, is rarely an instinct worth obeying without first allowing the slower, more considered parts of one's thinking to have their say. And so he sat, and he thought, and he let the memory come, not rushing it, not forcing it into the shape of a dramatized recollection, but simply allowing it to unfold with the quiet fidelity of a mind reviewing what it had recorded, in much the same way that a tailor or craftsman might unroll a length of cloth in good light to examine its weave and pattern. He had been a blade champion of the Shadow Keepers in those days, one of the finest, though he would not have described himself in those terms. He just did what was asked of him. When the traitor tide had breached the outer walls of the palace and begun its terrible press toward the inner sanctums and the dungeon levels beneath them, he had been part of the force assigned to hold the undercroft passages, low-ceilinged corridors of ancient stone, where the advantages of reach and formation counted for considerably less than the advantages of speed and precision. He remembers the sounds of that time more clearly than the shapes, which is perhaps to be expected. The stone of the undercroft had a quality that conducted vibration, so that the impacts and the cries and the pitch of a world-eater's war cry were present as something felt in the chest. He had fought in the passages where the light was poorest, and he had done what he had been made and shaped and refined across centuries to do. He had not known in those hours which cells had been breached. He had been fighting. That is the one true thing that can be said about the Siege of Terror, in the end, that it was everywhere at once, pressing in from every direction, demanding everything of everyone in it simultaneously, and that the person who was fighting in one corridor could know nothing of what was happening 30 meters away, except that it was, in all likelihood, equally desperate and equally immediate. He knows now, reconstructing it from what the archivist's fragment contains, working backward through the timeline, that the seals on Vrakas's cell had failed during a period when he himself had been engaged in the corridor that ran, by his calculation, approximately 30 meters from the relevant sublevel. He calculates the probability that he had walked past that corridor, past the open cell, past whatever had escaped from it, in the course of the fighting. The probability is uncomfortably high. He examines his response to this. He notes with honesty that he has always tried to bring to such moments that he does not feel guilt. He does not believe that guilt is the correct response. He was fulfilling his duty in the manner and the place that his duty required of him. The cell failed. These are two events, connected in time but separate in responsibility, and to treat them as a single thing with a single cause would be to reason sloppily about a matter that deserves to be reasoned about clearly. When he had decided his course of action, there was no ceremony. He does not stand and declare himself or make any formal commitment to the path that is now assembling itself. He simply understands that this world eater is his next target, and it will be attended to. He has the blade. He has the silver eye, which perceives the world with a thoroughness that goes considerably beyond what ordinary sight can manage, and which had seemed, when he first permitted its fitting, like a reasonable exchange for what he had given up. He has the network of quiet and careful acquaintances that he has spent years gathering in the shadows of the Imperium's vast bureaucratic life. People who move information through channels that the louder institutions are not always watching. These are tools enough. There is a particular freedom, he has found, in being no longer what he once was. A freedom that he had not anticipated when he had laid down his auramite plate and his presidium spear in the hall of armaments, and accepted the black robes in their place. He had spent 3,000 years as one of the 10,000, which is to say as one of the most singular and immediately recognizable kinds of being in the Imperium, a creature whose mere passage through a public corridor was enough to draw every eye and empty every easy conversation in the vicinity, not from dislike, but from the simple overwhelming fact of what he represented. There had been a weight to that over the long years, not an unpleasant weight, but a weight nonetheless, the accumulated gravity of being perpetually and unmistakably seen. Now he is a robed figure of indeterminate age on a forge world, and most people around him look past him with the comfortable inattention that people extend to those who appear to have nothing particular to offer or to threaten. Those that do look because of his unusual height. He moves through the world like water through stone, present, and leaving very little trace of the passage. He finds, to his mild and private surprise, that he prefers it. The hunt, as Orethus came to think of it, across the years of its unfolding, was not a thing that resembled the hunts of legend, not the swift and purposeful pursuit of a known quarry across known ground, with a clear beginning and a foreseeable end. It was slower and stranger and considerably lonelier than that, more akin to the work of someone attempting to read a book from which a great many pages have been torn, reconstructing the narrative not from what is present, but from the shape of what is absent. What Orethus understood in the early years was this: Vrachas was not what he had once been. The world-eaters of the Great Crusade had been terrible, overwhelming, indiscriminate, possessed of a fury so total that it left no room for anything else. What had escaped from 10,000 years of captivity and corruption and the slow transactional sustenance of a dark god's attention was something different in character, if not in fundamental nature. The body that Orethus was following bore, he would come to understand, the accumulated damage of an almost incomprehensible span of existence. Old wounds healed improperly, augmetics incorporated into the flesh and overgrown by it, a physical body that had been broken and reconstituted so many times that the boundary between the original thing and its repairs had long since been blurred. He did not lead warbands, he did not seek glory or conquest or any of the grand purposes that his legion had once pursued. He was, in the simplest and most honest assessment, too old and too damaged for any of that. Instead, he settled. Vrachas moved through the quieter margins of the Imperium, the agricultural stations and mining outposts and penal colonies and abandoned facilities that existed in the spaces between the places that anyone important was watching. And where he settled, the dying began. For a while it was slow enough and dispersed enough that no administrative system took meaningful notice of it. He gave the blood god what he had to give: methodical, dedicated, unhurried slaughter, offered up with the regularity of a craftsman. The blood god, in return, kept him breathing. It is, as arrangements go, one of the older and more honest kinds. The first site Orethus visited was an agricultural moon, a modest and unassuming place whose principal business was the cultivation of grain for the processing stations of a larger world nearby, and whose records revealed a pattern of disappearances that had been noted, queried, attributed to various mundane causes, and ultimately filed in the category of things that were not important enough to deal with. He arrived a year and a half after Vrachus had moved on, which meant that the immediate evidence was gone, and the survivors had had time to begin the long and not always successful work of constructing a life around what they had experienced. He interviewed them with care, in the quiet and unhurried manner that produced more useful information than any alternative approach. He had learned patience in this, as in most things, learned that the people who have survived something terrible need time to locate the memory of it. A handful of workers had sheltered in the irrigation tunnels during what they described as the final weeks. He listened to each of them in turn, without expression, and he noted what they said. One of them, a woman who had been a shift supervisor before the thing that had happened, described seeing a shape moving through the grain fields in the darkness, at a scale impossible to mistake. Impossibly large, she said. That last word, he noted, she used without being prompted toward it, and it was the word that stayed with him longest. He asked how long the dying had continued before anyone understood what was happening. She said nearly 6 months had passed before the disappearances were understood to be connected rather than incidental. He thanked her and left. The second site, a water processing station on the outer edge of a minor system, staffed by rotating crews of technicians, whose social connections to one another were largely professional and therefore easily severed without anyone raising an immediate alarm. This place brought him 3 months closer, close enough that the bodies were still present, which was useful, and that the altars had not yet been exposed to the full passage of time, which was more useful still. He examined these things and learned to read the iconography of them over that time. What he found was that the works had grown considerably more elaborate since what he would later identify as the first site. There was a consistency developing, a recurring set of symbols and proportions and spatial relationships that was not a frenzied improvisation of pure religious mania, but of something being refined across time, something being worked toward. He recorded what he could through the silver eye and considered it for a long time on the transit between that world and the next. The third site was an abandoned naval resupply depot at the edge of a system that had seen better days, and here he came within 11 days of finding Vrachus himself, close enough that the trail was still warm. There was among the ruins of what had been a functioning community before Vrachus had found it, a survivor of a different kind than those he had spoken with before. A young man, barely conscious, who had been a dock worker in his previous life, and who had, in the weeks or months before Orethus arrived, been something else. He had, by his own account, and by the evidence of the markings he carried, been a devoted follower, which is a thing that Orethus had learned to regard not with contempt, but careful attention, because the motivated follower is a more revealing kind of witness than the simple survivor. He interviewed the young man with patience and without cruelty, and he listened to what was said. The young man spoke of Vrachus in theological terms, almost as if he believed him to be a preacher or priest of some twisted belief system that promised salvation. He called him the Kept One, which was the name that those around him had settled on. And he described the central article of the theology Vrachus had offered them, that the blood god preserves those who are not yet finished with their purpose, that the ones who are kept alive across the impossible span of years are kept so because there remains something that only they can complete. Orethus listened to this, and then he asked what Vrachus's purpose was. The young man said he did not know. He said Vrachus had never told them. He had seemed, the young man said, after a pause in which he searched for the right word to be working it out. Aurethus thanked him and killed him. Despite the young man's willingness to answer questions, he had fallen into chaos and could not be allowed to live. Aurethus noted, on his travels between planets and the quiet corners of forge worlds and void stations, where his network of careful informants passed their information along, that people were frightened of very particular things, specific, imaginable, proximate things, and correspondingly calm about dangers of a scale and nature that should concern them considerably more. He had no judgment to offer about this. It was, he had concluded, simply the shape that mortal cognition takes when it is confronted with a universe too large and too dangerous to be held in mind all at once, and the response was as understandable as it was universal. On a transit vessel moving between the second and third sites, a mid-range passenger carrier of no particular distinction, carrying the usual mixture of functionaries and traders and families relocating themselves across the indifferent distances of the Imperium. A child of perhaps 7 or 8 years found her way to the cargo section, where he had taken a corner seat and sat in stillness that had become, for him, simply his natural state. She looked at him for a moment with the direct and undefended curiosity of a child, and then she asked him if he was a monk. He considered the question and said, something like that. She asked what he prayed for. He told her honestly that he did not pray. She accepted this without any apparent difficulty, in the childlike way many young people accept what is said by adults, and after a moment she went back to whatever she had been doing before, leaving him alone. He thought about the exchange for longer than he expected to, longer certainly than the interactions seemed to warrant, and he could not, in the end, determine precisely why it stayed with him. The intelligence that finally led him to Verath Secondus came from a former administratum clerk, who had, over a long career of modest official employment, developed a secondary vocation in the routing of information through channels that the louder and more formally constituted intelligence organs of the Imperium preferred not to acknowledge. She was thorough and reliable, and when her report arrived through their secret channels he had given her access to, Aurethus read it twice and understood that the long hunt was nearing its end. Unusual fatalities at a mining facility on a green-grey world of no particular significance. Access to the deep shaft levels, restricted by an authority that the facility's own records could not account for. Maintenance drones returning from the lower levels with residue on their chassis that the facility's technicians had logged, correctly but without full understanding, as anomalous biological material. He booked passage on a bulk ore carrier, the kind of vessel that moves through the quieter shipping lanes of the Imperium at a pace that prioritizes economy over speed, which suited him well enough, as he had never been in the kind of hurry that required a faster ship. And he spent the 19 days of the crossing in the cargo hold, in the dark, reviewing everything he knew about world eaters, which was a considerable amount, drawn from sources both official and otherwise, and supplemented by the irreplaceable knowledge of a man who had fought them in the undercroft of the imperial palace when the fate of everything hung in the balance. He arrived on Verath Secondus 3 weeks before the morning on which he now stood, 100 meters below the surface, descending into the dark with the past still moving through his memory. He had spent those 3 weeks doing what he always did on these hunts, watching and confirming and mapping, building the picture to the point of completeness before taking the step that closed the distance. Vrakas, he had concluded, had been on this world long enough to settle properly, to establish the routines and patterns of behavior that met the arrangement with his god. The slow and patient rhythm of what he offered and what he received in return. He would not flee. He had, as far as Orethus could determine, no remaining instinct for flight, if he had ever possessed one. The reflection had brought him this far, and now 100 meters down, with the stone close on either side and the darkness thickening steadily below, it paused. He continued downward. The first 200 meters of the descent were, in their way, the strangest part of all, not because they contained anything terrible, but because they contained nothing terrible at all, and the absence threatened to lull him into a false sense of security. It was simply a mine. Tools rested where they had been set down by hands that had intended to pick them up again. A wrench laid across the teeth of a dormant drill mechanism. A safety harness hanging from its bracket like someone had every intention of coming back soon to collect it. The drilling apparatus was cold and still, its enormous machinery settled in place. The walls were lined with the practical, unpretty architecture of industrial necessity, and the light fittings, where they had not failed, offered a thin and yellowish illumination that was better than nothing. It was, in all its particulars, simply the place that ordinary people had come to do ordinary work. He read the dust as he walked. There is a great deal that dust will tell a patient reader, where feet have been, and in what number, and with what purpose, where they have not been, and for how long, what has moved through a space, and what has not. The dust of the upper shaft had been undisturbed for some weeks across most of its surface, settling in after the air stopped moving and people stopped walking through to displace it. But running through it, down the center of the corridor, were the evenly spaced footprints of something very large. At 300 meters, he found the first body, a man who had, by the laminated identification card still clipped to the breast of his jacket, been a shift foreman, and who had died quickly and violently. Orethus examined this for a moment. Vrakas had been maintaining something here, in the upper levels, managing the boundary between the place that was his and the planet above. He continued down. At 400 meters, the corridor widened slightly at a junction where two secondary passages met the main shaft, and it was here that three figures were waiting, though waiting is perhaps too active a word for what they were doing. These men were standing as if they had been told to hold the position. They had been miners once, which was evident in the quality of their hands and in the practical heavy-duty clothing they still wore, though the clothing was marked now with symbols that had not been put there by any mining company. The symbols had been scored into the fabric, and he noted, into the skin beneath it in places, with something sharp and without any apparent concern for the discomfort of the process. They were not expecting him. They were, as far as Orethus could determine, not expecting anyone. He moved the moment they noticed him, a clean movement that combined both footwork and the drawing of his blade, and then they were on the ground, and he cleaned the weapon on the nearest jacket and sheathed it again. The whole of it had taken a brief moment. He stood for a moment and listened before moving on. One of the three had been young, 17 perhaps, or close to it, and had the hands of someone who had spent a meaningful portion of his short life doing physical work, the calluses across the palm, and the weathering of the knuckles that mine work produces in those who do it long enough. On his collarbone, visible above the collar of his jacket, was a scar that had not yet finished healing, still pink at the edges, still recent, the kind of mark that someone makes deliberately on another person to indicate a change in status or allegiance. Someone had found this boy, or the boy had found something, and the mark had been put on him not long ago. Orethus looked at this for a moment, and then continued down. The altars began below 500 meters, and they told a story that he read with the slow and genuine interest in an attempt to understand in more detail what he was dealing with. The first ones were improvised, rough arrangements of stone and salvage material that had the feel of early experiments, of a practice not yet certain of its own form. Further down, they became more deliberate, the geometry more considered. Further still, and they were something that he found himself reluctant to call anything other than architectural, structures that had required planning and effort, and the kind of sustained attention that is, whatever else one wishes to say about it, a form of devotion. He examined them as he passed, not hurrying, giving each a consideration. He was looking at a theology, a coherent set of beliefs and practices, and visual languages that had been built layer by layer, in a place where no one but its builder would ever see it. Which was, he found himself thinking, the detail that lodged most firmly and most uncomfortably in the mind as he walked. Who was this for? The question was not rhetorical, and he did not treat it as one. He turned it over in his mind. The altars were here, in the deep dark of a mine shaft on a world of no note, in a place where no congregation would ever gather, and no observer would ever pass through to be impressed or moved or converted. Vrakas had built them, it seemed, for himself, or for Khorne, which might be the same thing, or might be meaningfully different, and he was not certain which, or simply for the act of building, for the having of a practice in a life that had, in all other respects, become a thing of function. The second group of people were 7 in total, and they had arranged themselves with more care than the first. They had been sitting around in a side passage where the junction created a natural concealment, lounging and socializing in a spot that had clearly been chosen as a place to guard. Whether they had heard him coming or had simply been placed there against the general possibility of intrusion, he could not tell, and it did not greatly matter. The corridor here was narrow in the way of secondary mine passages everywhere, wide enough for 2 people to pass, but no more, and this meant that the work required sequencing rather than the raw application of force, the blade moving through the small, practiced arcs of confined spaces. It took a little longer than the first encounter, which is not to say that it took very long. One of them, toward the end, managed the beginning of a prayer, the first syllable of something that his lips had begun to form before the opportunity for its completion was removed. He did not find this pitiable. He found it, as he found most things, informative. They had known what he was, or had known enough about what he represented, and they had prayed anyway, had reached in the final instant for the comfort of the practice they had built their recent lives around. He stood among the dead, looking at them and seeing the same markings and the same haggard look. They were undoubtedly the servants of chaos. They had found Vrakas, or Vrakas had found them, and they had followed something into the deep dark of a mine shaft, and they had stayed. He had spent 40 years reconstructing the wake of devastation that Vrakas left behind him, thinking of it as damage, as something done to people who had not chosen it and could not have anticipated it. And this was true as far as it went. But it did not account for this, the willing few who chose to turn from the Imperium. He filed the thought and moved on. Deeper still, the corridor narrowed further as the shaft approached the geological void that the drilling had eventually opened below, and it was here, at what the facility's own schematics had identified as the final transition point before the lower chamber, that he found the third group and understood at once that someone among them had known what they were doing. 12 of them tactically positioned across the narrowing. The mining equipment they carried had been adapted with the kind of ingenuity that military necessity tends to produce in people who have the aptitude for it. The autogun, there was one positioned at the rear with a clear line through the bottleneck, was the piece that concerned him most, not because he was unable to address it, but because its placement demonstrated that whoever had arranged this had understood the problem they were solving. This was not Vrachus's work. Vrachus, as far as Orethus had been able to determine, had long since moved beyond the management of tactical details. This was the work of someone who had, before whatever had brought them here had taken hold, possessed a genuinely capable mind. He did not take the bottleneck. There was a maintenance crawlway running parallel to the main passage. He had noted it on the schematics, had measured it against his own size, and had concluded that it was sufficient. He moved through it carefully, making sure not to make any noise that would give himself away. He came through the crawl space above and behind the arranged position. The autogun never fired. He dropped behind the autogunner and, in one smooth movement, drew his blade in a broad arc that cut through the bone and sinew of the neck. The next 30 seconds were a wash of flowing movement, the flickering of robes and the desperate swinging of mining equipment as the remaining force made an attempt to fight back as this wraith flowed through them, dressed in black. The man who had arranged the bottleneck was the last, and when Orethus reached him, there was a moment in which he looked at the man's face and saw behind the devotion that had brought him here, and the corruption that had shaped him since, something that had not entirely gone, something that was still in there, looking out. Sadly, it was not enough, and the man fell to join the others. He stood in the cleared space for a time, in the warm orange light that was coming up from the fire below, and painting the rock walls in colors that would have been beautiful in any other circumstance. He was, by his calculation, 50 meters from the cavern entrance. He could hear, or perhaps feel, through the stone, the quality of an enclosed space of enormous size, the way vast chambers have an acoustic weight to them, a resonance that differs from smaller spaces, the way a cathedral differs from a room. He had been thinking of Vrachus across all of the 40 years as the thing that needed ending, as the source, as the point at which the damage originated and from which it flowed outward into the communities it found and the people it consumed. And this was true as far as it went. But the damage required materials, and the materials, the boy, the dock worker who had called Vrachus the kept one, the materials had come forward willingly. He sheathed the blade and went on. The shaft opened, and the world below it opened with it. An enormous geological void, 300 meters across, and deep enough that the drilling had stopped, the workers apparently judging that there was nothing more worth pursuing. They had left the space to the dark and the silence, and now to the fire that burned at its center, that seemed to be fueled by some subterranean gases or oil. The altar complex that surrounded it was the most elaborate he had yet seen, clearly marked and created for the blood god. He stood at the threshold and felt, or registered, or noted the quality of the silence below him change. It was the silence of something aware of him, something that had known, before he had taken the final step that brought him to the edge, that he was coming. He drew the blade. He had carried one question through 40 years of this hunt, and standing here at the threshold of what would end them, he found that he still did not know the answer to it. What does a thing like this want after 10,000 years? What, after all of that, does it still need to do? The fire burned below and offered no reply. Then he went down to find one. He was seated at the center of the cavern, and he had been waiting for some time. This was the first thing Orethus saw, descending the final slope into the vast geological dark. Not that Vrachus was present, which he had known before he crossed the threshold, but that Vrachus had known he was coming, and had chosen, with deliberation, to remain exactly where he was. To sit in the middle of everything. Those long descending altars had been building toward, and to wait. The floor of the cavern was one of the most extraordinary things Orethus had ever seen. The geometry of it was vast and intricate, and entirely coherent. Weeks of labor, he estimated, inscribed in the blood of the people who had worked this mine. Every line and symbol placed with long considered care. It was the finished work of everything the earlier altars had been working toward, the final expression of an offering to gods that humanity had been at war with for thousands of years. And at its center, Vrakas. He was not what the histories remembered, the legion warrior of the Great Crusade, lean, purposeful, a terrible thing engineered for killing, had become something else, something vast, layered over with the physical record of an existence that had endured far beyond any reasonable span. Old wounds had healed in odd ways, producing a silhouette that was less the shape of a warrior and more the shape of a landscape that had been changed many times. Augmetics that had been grafted on at some point in the long centuries had been incorporated and overgrown, the boundary between machine and flesh having long since dissolved into something that was neither. The armor he wore was now a second skeleton, fused and inseparable from the body beneath it, as though the distinction between the thing that protects and the thing being protected had, over sufficient time, simply ceased to be. He had become, Orithus thought, like an old tree that grows and gnaws around objects close to it. It was the sight of a thing that had lived for a long time in this way. Vrakas looked at him. As Orithus looked back, he could have sworn he saw recognition in the thing's eyes, a genuine recognition of the kind that requires memory, the kind that says, "I have seen this face before, in a particular place, at a particular time, and I have not forgotten it." The silver eye Orithus understood was what he knew. It was the detail that had survived the passage of the centuries in Vrakas's awareness, the single point of reference that connected the robed figure now descending into his cavern to whatever the Shadow Keepers had been. In the deep corridors of the imperial palace, in the last days before the emperor fell. Neither of them spoke. The fire burned its red and sourceless burning, and the cavern held its immense and resonant silence, and the two of them remained across the distance of the ruined floor from one another for a span of time that was not, as Orithus felt, the silence of two enemies preparing for war. It felt more like a silence of two beings who had spent a very long time alone, who had, each in their own different way and for their own different reasons, arrived at a condition of fundamental solitude, and who recognized that quality in each other. It was unexpected, a kind of kinship they had no framework for. Vrakas spoke first, eventually, in a voice that sounded like it had not been used for ordinary conversation in a great many years, and has not missed it. "You came alone," he said. It was not a question. It was an observation, stated flatly. A pause followed. "So did I." Vrakas was not speaking of a choice. He was speaking of a condition. He had come alone because there was nothing left that could come with him. No legion, no brotherhood, no name that anyone living spoke with anything other than fear. He was alone the way a ruin is alone, not having deliberately looked for solitude, but having persisted long enough that everything else was gone. And Orithus, standing in his black robes with his plain blade, heard those words and the subtext within them. Vrakas was telling him, without meaning to, that they had arrived at the same place by different roads. The difference, and he reached for it, because he needed it to be there, was that Vrakas's solitude was the product of destruction, of the long and terrible process of everything being taken or broken or worn away, while his own was the product of purpose, of choice, of service freely given. This was a real difference. He was not certain, in this moment, that it was as large a difference as he had always assumed. He said nothing. He moved. It would be a lie to call this a duel. A duel implies a contest between two combatants, a meeting of forces whose outcome is uncertain, and none of these things were accurate. Orethus was faster than Vrachas, and more precise, and had refined the art of violence across thousands of years of active practice into something that barely resembled a person fighting, and more resembled a natural process occurring. The movement of water, finding the path of least resistance through stone, fluid, and without waste, every motion the minimum necessary, and not one fraction more. But Vrachas was sustained by something that did not respond to injury in the ordinary ways, and this meant that a strike that would have ended most things within the first several seconds of the engagement did not. Orethus drew first blood within seconds of closing the distance. Vrachas fought in a very different way. The creature fought without technique, without form, without any of the legion doctrine that had presumably once organized his violence into something with edges and intentions. Now he moved with mass and aggression, and the belief that whatever pain arrived in him would not cause him to stop. He moved fast for something so warped and large, moving with Orethus across the floor of the cavern, through the elaborate pattern of the altars. The altar complex was being destroyed in the process. The careful weeks of work, the finished inscriptions in the blood of the dead, the expression of a practice built across decades. It was being unmade by the simple fact of two large and purposeful beings moving through it in opposition to each other. He observed this, and noted that Vrachos gave no sign of caring about it. However, the fight was at the forefront of his mind. Time and time again, Orethus struck at the creature, and time again, the damage that continued to build did not seem to be enough. His blade swung in smooth, flowing arcs as he continued to find gaps in the guard of the monster and the weak points between armor plating. There was another weakness that the old custodian had noticed when they two first began their fight. A clear pattern in the movement of the chaos, warped warrior in front of him. Deep in the hip, where an old wound had healed with no access to proper care. A constraint on the pivot, small but consistent, a restriction that appeared in the same moment every time the same movement was attempted. He had been patient with it across the whole of the engagement, giving himself time to confirm the pattern, waiting for the moment when it would become a deciding thing rather than an interesting detail. The moment arrived as he sidestepped quickly around his enemy, causing it to rotate on the spot and exposing the hesitation caused by the old wound. He used the floor, and Vrachas fell. In the momentary opening, Orethus feinted a low strike and came up high under the chin of the enemy. It was something which could have been parried or avoided if Vrachas was healthier, but he was not, and he fell. The fire in the chamber went out. It did not gutter or fade. It simply ceased, between one moment and the next, as though whatever agreement had maintained it had been concluded, one way or another. The darkness that replaced it was the deep, absolute dark of a place far below the reach of any natural light, and in that darkness the only sound that remained was the sound of Orethus breathing, steady and measured. He stood in the dark, and the silence of the cavern settled around him, and the long 40 years arrived at their conclusion. He worked in the dark, but the dark was no obstacle to him. Although his ordinary eyesight was much greater than that of a human, his silver eye provided even greater vision down here in the dark. He made sure that the creature on the floor in front of him was indeed his target. There was no room for error. After some time and investigation, there could be no doubt. He was thorough. He had always been thorough. The altar complex, which had represented weeks of labor, was, in the straightforward physical sense, gone. The structures had been destroyed in the conflict. However, the place was still recognizable as a bed of chaos. And this would not do. After looking around for some time, Orethus found what seemed to be blast charges that are often used to dislodge rubble, large boulders, and other obstructions. These he places around the chamber to make sure none of the symbolism would remain once he had gone, and he set a timer before moving on. The ore dust was still settling, drifting down through the dark in the slow way of things that are finding their way back to rest. From somewhere far above, so far that the sound of it was barely a quality of the air, rather than a sound in any proper sense. The geothermal vents breathed their warmth downward into the cold of the deep stone, as they had been doing since long before any human being had stood in this cavern, and would continue doing long after the last trace of what had happened here was gone. He thought about the words Vrachas had said to him, the two of them. So did I. Connecting the two of them having come to this place alone, with no brothers, no legion, no support. It was an odd thing to feel a hint of connection to the enemy in this way, especially an enemy who had so clearly fallen so far from the cradle of civilization. The cultist at the naval depot had told him how Vrachas had explained his own survival to those who followed him, that the blood god preserves those who are not yet finished with their purpose, that the ones who are kept alive across the impossible span of years are kept so because the purpose is not yet complete, and the god does not release what the god still requires. Vrachas had served Khorne totally across 10,000 years. He had been hollowed out by that service, gradually and completely. It seemed like everything that was not useful in that service was worn away, until there was only the husk of a thing left, scratching out their place in the universe on the edges of the Imperium. The blood god had kept him alive because he had a purpose yet to fulfill, a twisted duty that had yet to be finished. Orethus wondered about what that purpose could have been, and what he had stopped here today. Perhaps the creature would have gone on to do terrible things in the name of the blood god. Perhaps he would have been responsible for great suffering, or perhaps he would have continued in this same way. It was impossible to say. Orethus didn't feel emotion about this. He felt some level of satisfaction and a pleasure in completing another hunt for the Emperor. But he was not angry at what had been done here, was not sad at the loss of life. He had believed for a very long time that the absence of feeling was a kind of completion, that he had simply become, through the long process of service, entirely what he was meant to be, with nothing left over that was not in service to his purpose, no sensation wasted on anything the purpose did not require. He had found a kind of peace in this understanding, or something that functioned like peace, which he had been willing to accept in the absence of any clear alternative. The thought that would not leave was more subtle than any of that, and more difficult to dismiss. It was not that he had become complete. It was that he could not tell if he was devoid of emotion because he was more complete, or if he was devoid of emotion because he was designed to be a tool. As he made his way back to the surface, he thought about this for a while. Then he decided that it did not matter. If he was a tool, he was simply a tool that is in service for something he believed in. He emerged into the grey-green world, into daylight, but the overcast sky made it impossible to tell the time of day. The light was flat and sourceless, the horizon lost behind the low cloud that had sat over the plateau. The drilling rig stood motionless, patiently accepting their fate to erode and eventually fall. The air smelled of moss and cold stone, and the deeper smells brought up by the geothermal vents, which went on breathing their slow warmth upward into the indifferent sky. Standing at the lip of the mine, he transmitted information through his private channels, a brief and encoded confirmation with just enough information for those who needed to know, and no more than that. No one would come here after him. No official account would be written, no ceremony performed, no record added to any archive that a future archivist might one day catalogue and flag as anomalous. The world of Verath Secondus would continue producing its mediocre ore, and these abandoned mines would stay silent while others would be set up elsewhere on the surface. It would remain an unremarkable place, but it would be a safer one after today. He looked at the horizon for a moment, the long, flat line of it, grey against grey, ordinary but beautiful in its own way, with the speckles of green moss that seemed to cover everything in sight. There were 3 leads in his pending files, each of which was a thread that needed to be pulled carefully. Each one might lead somewhere that required his attention. Any one of them might, in time, become his next purpose. They had been waiting for him to finish what he had just finished. He began to walk toward the transit station, which was a modest structure several kilometers across the plateau, and offered connections to the shipping lanes that would carry him wherever the next thread led. He did not look back at the mouth of the shaft when the blast charges went off, causing a deep rumble through the nearby rock.